Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to the seminar. This seminar is the seventh and the last seminar of a series. This series of seminars, it's generated or happened because of a survey done in 2015 last year. We did a survey to 3,500 Hong Kong citizens, as well as 35 what we call the internal experts, including judges, lawyers, high officials, and police officers. Today, our topic is "Do Hong Kong people treasure rights?" On my left-hand side are our speakers and discussant. Karen Lee is the assistant professor of Department of Social Science, the Education University of Hong Kong. And Mr. Kevin Lau, he is one of the most senior journalists in Hong Kong. He is the former editor-in-chief of the Ming Pao. And Miss Karen Kong, also Karen, she is the assistant professor of Faculty of Law here in Hong Kong U. So Mr. Kevin Lau will comment on the first 4 questions, and then Karen Kong will comment on the last 3rd questions. So we have 7 questions today. So may I now invite Mr. Lau?
Hi, morning everybody. Now, do you have this piece of information that is the result of the questionnaire on the first 4 questions? You have, yes, we have it.
Yeah, it's on the screen.
On the screen. And some of you may also have it printed on a paper in front of you, okay? So let's take a look at the results of these 4 important questions concerning civil and political rights. Now, there are 2 columns of responses with different figures and percentages. The left column, internal legal culture, is the result of social leaders, lawyers, government officials, people who are responsible for enforcing the legal system, making decisions. Let's call them the decision makers. And the right column, the external legal culture, is the result of the general public. I was told that the size of the survey is about 3,500 respondents or interviewees who took the effort to complete a questionnaire. I have a copy of the questionnaire. So, if you compare the results in these 2 columns, you will find a huge gap. For example, on the first question, whether it is proper for civil society organizations to be under the supervision by government agencies, that's whether NGO should be regulated by the government. Our social elites and lawyers took an overwhelming response of no, disagree. 75% disagrees. Only 15.5% agree. Okay? Let's for the time being skip the strongly agree or strongly disagree. Just broadly speaking, agree and disagree. Okay? But if you look at the layman's response, it's just the opposite. 59% agree to the statement that NGO should be subject to government supervision. Only 21.5% disagree with this proposition. Okay? So that means the majority of our social elites, government officials, lawyers were against subjecting civil society organizations to government supervision. But the majority of the public agree to such supervision. Okay? Similar discrepancy can be found in question 2, when the media has a duty to promote government policy. 63% of our elites and lawyers said they don't agree. Only 7.7% agree. But the public responded by an overwhelming yes. 60% said yes. Media has a duty to promote government policy. Only 23% of the public disagree. Huge gap again. Now, look at question 4. Maintaining order is more important than protecting individual freedoms. More important. Public order is more important than individual freedom. 71.8% of our elites and lawyers said, no, this is wrong, I disagree with it. But 57.6% say, this statement sounds correct. Again, the majority of the public agree that maintaining order is more important than individual freedom's protection. So, how do we perceive, understand, interpret this huge gap? Does it mean that Hong Kong people in general do not treasure these civil and political rights, while government officials and lawyers who are more sophisticated, who have studied law perhaps, only these people understand civil and political rights? Are we going to draw such conclusion by looking at the results of these failed questions? My view is no, we cannot draw this conclusion. We should not draw this conclusion too readily. Why? The figures speak for itself. The gap is so huge. Why cannot we draw a conclusion? Why can't we draw a conclusion? The first reason is difference in perception and interpretation of the question. Now, if you are a lawyer or a government official, and when you are asked the question whether it is proper for civil society organizations to be under the supervision by government agencies, you immediately know, that means we have to enact a law to set up a government agency to oversee the operation and functioning of all the NGOs. Wow, that's very problematic. It costs a lot of money. It will stir up a lot of political controversy, and it will add a huge administrative burden to the government. What for? What's the benefit? Why? Is there a social necessity for us to do so? You're inclined to say no. But when you ask a layman, is it proper for civil society organizations to be under the supervision by government? What would the layman think? The layman would immediately associate, civil society organizations? Are you talking about the charity groups which stand in the street to collect public money? Are you talking about the people raising funds, persuading people to donate money, even by making deceptive telephone calls? Well, of course, they could not act above the law. We should not allow them to deceive the public and collect money in whatever way they want. They must be subject to some form of government supervision. You see? The layman has a reason to think in that way, because real life experience tells them there are bad civil organizations in this world which are not genuine charities, which are very deceptive and should be punished. So, there is no meeting of mind between the two groups when they are faced with the same question. I give you another example. Media has a duty to promote government policy. For a sophisticated government official or lawyer, that statement means the media has a legal obligation, regulatory duty to promote government policy. If they refuse to promote government policy, they will be subject to punishment. But to a layman, this statement simply means, should radio, TV broadcast messages to promote government public health policy, to remind the public that avian flu is widespreading, we should be more alert? Of course, there are these public interest announcements from every day. You can hear it on the radio, you can see it on the TV. What's the problem? Of course, public media has a role to play, has a duty to promote these things. The layman might not think in terms of legal duty, regulation, fine and punishment, encroachment in media freedom. No. Again, there may not be a meeting of minds when they answer the same question. Same for maintaining order is more important than protecting individual freedoms. For a well-trained lawyer, the word more means we always give priority to public order and to curtail individual freedom protection. But to a layman, to a Chinese, he might just think it in a traditional philosophical way, which means, well, there is always a balance between public interest, public security, and individual freedom. Neither one is of overwhelming importance. We cannot sacrifice the other for one. So, layman would think in that way. And then he might perceive that, of course, individual protection, freedom protection is important, but you cannot sacrifice social order. While you have the right to demonstrate, you have the right to peaceful assembly, but it doesn't mean you can break the law. You can do whatever you want. So maintaining order is important. If there is no public order, how can you safely and peacefully express your views? So for that reason, he might say yes to the statement. While the lawyers and the elites who are sophisticated enough to look into the subtle meaning of more important might say, no, I disagree. So, the above examples tell us that there could be substantial difference in the perception and interpretation of the same question, which lead to the substantially different answers. Because of this possibility, which is a real possibility, we cannot simply compare the percentage in the left column with the percentage in the right column, because we may not be comparing apple to apple. We may be comparing orange to apple. Okay? That's the first reason why I refuse to draw a conclusion on the so-called gap of responses. There is a second reason. There is a second reason. There is a difference between civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights. If you look at the nature of civil and political rights, very few of them are absolute. Maybe you can say the freedom of thought, freedom of religion are close to absolute. But all other civil and political freedoms and rights, such as, say, freedom of expression, which concern my industry a lot, it is not absolute. If you look at the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, you will readily find 6 legitimate grounds to restrict the right to freedom of expression. Those 6 are national security, public order, public health, public morality, rights and interests of others. And the European Convention on Human Rights further elaborate these 6 and make it into 10 different grounds on which you can lawfully restrict the right to freedom of expression. So, the real test is not whether you have this right or not. The real test is proportionality. Proportionality, which means whether a specific measure implemented by the executive authorities which restrict the right to freedom of expression is proportionate to the social need to have such restriction. For example, if there is a riot in the street, the social need might justify a restriction on civil liberties, say by imposing a curfew. But if there's no riot, simply because it's New Year Day, many people go out to watch the firework. So in order to reduce people on the public street, we impose curfew. That would be disproportionate. Okay? So the concept of proportionality is highly conditional on the actual circumstances. whether imposing a curfew is compatible with human rights protection depends on the circumstances. It depends on whether there is a pressing social need and whether the restriction imposed is proportionate to that social need. It requires sophisticated judgment. Thus, this fine balance, this sophisticated judgment, cannot be readily expressed in a simple question, such as, it is proper for civil society organization to be under the supervision by government agencies. Media has a duty to promote government policy. What's supervision? What does supervision by government mean? What is the duty to promote government policy? What does that mean? Simply by looking at these words, we have no way to tell whether it infringes international human rights standard as enshrined in the ICCPR. We don't know. Therefore, the response to this simple question cannot be taken literally as a public response to human rights protection laid down by the ICCPR. It cannot be taken as yes, it cannot be taken as a no. We cannot say that, according to the public survey, 59% of the respondents are not sympathetic to human rights protection under ICCPR. Only 21.5% are sympathetic. You cannot draw this conclusion. In order to draw any meaningful conclusion, you have to ask the public more specific questions. For example, whether they would tolerate a peaceful demonstration in contravention to traffic law, which delayed traffic, which occupy public streets. Or whether they can accept relaxing the rule that local broadcasting stations, including radio and TV, has to be run by Hong Kong permanent residents in order to attract more capital investment into the field of broadcasting. By asking specific questions of this type, you would be able, or you would be in a better position to find out the real preferences of the public. Actually, a similar concern lies with economic and social rights. The key word in civil and political rights is proportionality. The key word in economic, social, and cultural rights is affordability. If you look at the other three questions, which we will deal with in the next part, you would find that both the elites and the public respond by an overwhelming majority that they agree that all should live with a minimum living standard, that workers should have the right to collective bargaining. But how much meaning can we draw on these results? Can we say that, both the elites and the public strongly agree with minimum living standard and collective bargaining power of the labor? On the face of it, you can draw that conclusion. But be careful. When you ask specific questions, whether every year when the employers is about to decide how to adjust the salary of the employees, they must talk to the trade union first and the final decision is subject to the agreement of the trade union. Do you agree? For example, if they ask whether the government should increase salary tax by 5 percentage points so that we can substantially increase social welfare payments to lift everyone on social welfare net to a minimum living standard. You may not be able to find the same overwhelming majority as you do in this survey. Once you put that general hypothesis, whether it's collective bargaining power or whether it's minimum living standard, which sounds like mother care is good. But once you put that into a real-life question, which involves balancing of interests, which involves cost and benefit, which involves paying out of your pocket, you will see the difference. Nevertheless, having said all the above, to challenge the conclusion on the gap, the big gap between the elites and the public, I have to admit that question number 3 caused me some trouble. Look at question number 3. To what extent do you agree with this statement? The rights possessed of by an individual are not inborn, but granted to him by society in reward for his good performance. 人嘅權利並唔係與生俱來嘅，係社會根據佢嘅表現而賦予嘅。I have to admit that both the elites and lawyers and the layman, the public, would perceive this statement in similar way. This statement does not allow much discrepancies in interpretation. So, it is a troubling figure that 41.6% of the respondents in the survey say yes to the statement. 41%, exactly 41.6% say no to it. That means equal number of our public are agreeing or disagreeing with that statement, that the rights possessed by an individual are not inborn, but given to her or him by society in reward for his or her good performance. How come we have 41% saying yes to this statement? This tells us something. I am prepared to accept that this may mean 40% of the public of Hong Kong perceive human rights as non-absolute, as conditional, and as capable of being compromised. Okay? I'm ready to make that concession. But before I make that concession, I would want to test it with more specific questions, real-life questions. So I hope this survey is only a beginning, not the end, because we need to ask more questions to have a deeper understanding into the public mind. Okay, I will stop here.
Thank you, Calvin. Actually, the survey, we have 70 questions to both the public and the internal experts. Originally, we have more than 100 questions, but the survey company advised us not to ask too many questions because nowadays it's very difficult to have someone sit down in front of a phone and answer your 70 questions. So it had been quite a painful process that we cut down several couples of questions. Yes, I think we agree that we need to ask more in order to read into the mind of our citizens. So now let's give time to Ms. Kong.
Okay, good morning, everyone. The questions that I am asked to discuss mainly concerns socio-economic rights. So maybe let's take a look at the questions. The first one, we are asking the respondents whether they agree that workers should have the right of collective bargaining. So this is one of the labor rights that we are asking. And the second question, to what extent do they agree that ensuring every person in the society to enjoy a basic level of living standard should be the goal of the society? So this is related to the social economic right to an adequate standard of living. And the third one, to what extent do you agree with this statement? If someone is poor, he or she must be lazy. There's no particular socioeconomic rights that I can comment on, but I would look at this from the perspective of the right to social welfare. Okay? So I will look at these questions one by one, but before that, I would just like to give you my general observations or propositions before we begin. Okay? So from the survey outcome, I think Hong Kong people generally support workers' right to collective bargaining, at least in general abstract terms. However, many do not fully understand the content of other socio-economic rights. Second, Hong Kong people disagree as to the extent to which the government should have the responsibility to ensure socio-economic rights of the poor. Thirdly, despite the survey result, my observation is that not all Hong Kong people truly embrace the right to equality. And lastly, I think there is a need for more discussion of socio-economic rights in Hong Kong. So let's jump to the first question. Okay? So the first question is about whether the respondent agrees that workers should have the right to collective bargaining. If we look at the external legal culture, meaning the views of the general public, we see that there are 86.4% of the people who agrees or strongly agrees with the statement. And similar result can be found for the legal professions and also the decision makers of the society. 90.2% of the respondents think that workers should have the right to collective bargaining. Okay, so what is collective bargaining? Okay, it is a type of workers' right whereby the workers can negotiate on equal footing with their employers on issues of wages, working conditions, and other matters concerning the terms of their employment. And collective bargaining law would impose an obligation on the employer to come to the negotiation table to discuss the terms with their employees. In Hong Kong, we do not have collective bargaining law. Okay? We have some protection of the workers' right to strike as well as to join trade unions. that is protected in Basic Law, Article 27. And our employment ordinance gives protection for employees who join trade unions. So they cannot be discriminated or dismissed because of any union activities or joining members as members of the trade union. However, as I said, there is no formal collective bargaining law. Okay? The reason, of course, is mainly because of the government's inclination to protect the rights of the business sector. Okay? And we did have a private members bill or private members legislation before 1997. That is the employees' right to representation, consultation, and collective bargaining ordinance. But this legislation that gives the right to collective bargaining was repealed in 1997. Okay. And even though, as you all know, we have a number of laws that protect labor's right, for example, minimum wages, non-discrimination in employment, and workers' compensation law, there's still a lot of conflicts and tension between employees and their employers in relation to working conditions. And one of the most striking example, as you will recall, is the strike by the dockers working in the Hong Kong international terminals back in 2003. And we did see that there were a lot of supports for this strike back then, including many students. The general public were willing to donate money and even sit with the protesters on the street to ask for higher pay from the employer. And the employer actually is a company indirectly related to our tycoon Li Ka-shing. Okay. And finally, the dockers succeeded to have a pay rise of 9.8% in that case. So I would say that generally speaking, we can see Hong Kong people support this right of collective bargaining, but with the tension between employers and employees, if we put that in specific cases, as Kevin has mentioned, we will not be sure that in each particular case, Hong Kong people would favor labor right above the business right. And so I think there is a need to discuss about whether we do need a collective bargaining law in Hong Kong, because without that, any negotiation between the employers and employees would be voluntary. So it's not compulsory for the employer to come to the negotiation table. Okay, this is the second question, which is related to the right to an adequate living standard in Hong Kong. So the respondents were asked whether they agree that ensuring every person in the society to enjoy a basic level of living standard should be the goal of the society. Okay? And here we also see overwhelming support from both the external legal culture, meaning the general public, as well as the legal personnel and the government officials about this statement. So this is a general statement about what an ideal Hong Kong should be like and how we should construct our society for the future. It's interesting to see that if we look at the data classifying people according to age or sex or their income level, there is no big difference on the views of the people. So it looks like a general consensus about this. Okay. Every person, of course, has a basic need for survival, and we do have a need to live a life of value above our mere survival. So the society should ensure that each person's basic needs are satisfied so that they can continue to pursue a life of value. And the corresponding rights of that responsibility of the society would be a right to a basic level of living standard. Okay? There is no right language used in this statement, and we cannot really tell for sure whether respondents have in mind we are asking them about a human right topic. Okay? But this is actually a right that is protected back in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So the right to adequate standard of living is equally important as all the other civil and political rights in the other international human rights instruments. Okay. So in this question, you will see that the respondents are asked whether every person should enjoy a basic level of living standard. But we do not know what the respondents have in mind about how basic is the basic level of living standard. Okay. This question means that there is a minimum threshold or maybe an essential level of items that a person should be able to enjoy before the basic level is achieved. So the question is whether Hong Kong people have in mind the absolute kind of poverty like what we see in the third world countries. If a person's mere survival is satisfied, then the government has fulfilled its responsibility. Or whether Hong Kong people think there is a relativity to the idea of poverty. And poverty here, are we referring to poverty for a person living in a modern, affluent city of Hong Kong? Okay? So from this survey, we cannot find out the result. So therefore, I was looking at other sociological studies on what Hong Kong people think would be a basic level of living standard. So this is one I've found. It is a study on public perception of minimum living standard in 2015. And the result is that Hong Kong people holds a relative view about contemporary living standard. So when they are asked what are the minimum necessities that would be necessary for a Hong Kong family consist of a couple and 2 children, they think these basic needs would include, for example, fresh fruit or vegetables at least once a day, meat or fish every other day, 3 meals a day, enough warm clothes for cold weather. And some respondents also go beyond this and think 1 set of decent clothes for job interview, a small amount of money to spend each week on himself, not just on the family, and the ability to offer a gift for a friend's wedding. So these, they think, would be the minimum standard of living. Even though perhaps we may not agree with this, though there's room for discussion, but I think it is important for Hong Kong to deliberate on what we think would be a minimum standard of living, because that would be important to set the goal of the society as well as for policy making. Okay, so in the question, the statement said ensuring every person in the society to enjoy a basic level of living standard should be the goal. Okay? However, I wonder to what extent do Hong Kong people really think that every person means everyone living in Hong Kong? Okay? Because as we can see, Hong Kong people tends to make a lot of distinction between people who are permanent residents and people who are not, and also people of different races. Okay? So one example I can tell is from the Court of Final Appeal decision. Kong Yunming, and Director of Social Welfare. So this is a case about whether a new immigrant from mainland China can enjoy the right to comprehensive social security assistance in Hong Kong. So this is a constitutional case about the basic law right to social welfare. Okay? And comprehensive social security assistance, as you know, is a safety net to protect the poorest in Hong Kong, to ensure their basic needs. After the Court of Final Appeal decided in favor of the new immigrants, there was a large outcry in the general public against the decision. People were saying that this decision actually contravenes the rule of law because it was a kind of assistance from our court to protect mainland interests, etc. Another area where we would wonder whether Hong Kong really embraces the right to equality is our view about refugees in Hong Kong. So whether or not refugees should be provided with assistance from the government to satisfy their basic needs is also a controversial question. Okay? This is not to say that the government should provide the same level of protection to all these different groups of people. That would be a normative question. And some differentiation, of course, is justified, even in the human rights standard. But it is necessary for us to think more and deeper about the extent to which we are willing to ensure people in Hong Kong of different citizenship or nationality such an adequate level of living standard. Okay. So back to the statement again, it says ensuring every person in the society to enjoy a basic level of living standard should be the goal of the society. Okay? It does not say who should be the one to ensure every person a basic level of living standard. Okay? Perhaps society would generally means the government. Okay? As I look at some academic literature, it looks like that people would generally understand society to mean the political organ that would design and enforce the rules that govern the distribution of benefits and burden of individuals in the society. So that would mean the government. Okay? Another reference we can make is from the Education University of Hong Kong survey done in 2010. In that similar survey, respondents were asked whether the government has the responsibility to ensure everyone an adequate standard of living. And the result of the survey is also an overwhelming yes. So we can assume that here people are referring to the government's responsibility. So in relation to human rights standards, of course, the primary responsibility to make sure a person's basic needs are satisfied would be on himself. So he has to earn a living for himself. But if there are other situations by which he became unable to meet his basic needs, then it would be on the responsibility of the government to ensure these basic necessities are satisfied. Okay? So do Hong Kong people embrace this standard? Okay. Perhaps some hint can be found from the next question, okay, which said, to what extent do you agree that if someone is poor, he or she must be lazy? Okay. So maybe the English translation is slightly different from the Chinese one. In Chinese, it said, 一個人窮就係因為佢懶. So in Chinese, actually, it's clearly a question about responsibility. Okay? Who is responsible for a person's poverty? Or who is to be blamed for a person's poverty? Okay? From the survey, you will see for the general public, 26.2% think that a person is poor because he is lazy. 59% think that if someone is poor, it's not because he is lazy. Okay? And the result is quite different from the legal personnel or the government officials or social elites. So for them, only 2.4% agrees that if someone is poor, it's because he or she is lazy. Whereas an overwhelming 90.2% do not agree that if someone is poor, he or she must be lazy. Okay? So there's rather big discrepancy between the view of the general public and the legal personnel can show their idea about the cause of poverty. Okay? So for the general public, 26.2% think that it's due to personal choice, okay, that a person is poor. Whereas the 90.2% in the legal profession and 59% of the general public think that there may be other reasons for a person's poverty. For example, some uncontrollable situation like sickness or disability, okay? Or because of other social and economic factors like the way in which the society is arranged, which favors the rich and prejudices the poor, or some structural injustice in the society that deprive the poor of the reward that they deserve, even if they work long hours. Okay? And the poor usually suffered more disproportionately from the effect of inflation and economic downturn. So there are all these factors which means that the poor does not deserve to be poor, and they should not be blamed, okay, for the fact that they are poor. So does it mean that Hong Kong people do not recognize the right of the poor? For those who believe that if someone is poor because he is lazy. Okay? So for those who think that poverty is a result of personal choice, we do not know for sure, but I think naturally they may be more inclined to object the government providing welfare, or inclined to object the government giving a right to welfare, okay, to people. For those who think poverty is or is mainly the result of conditions outside a person's control, then they may be naturally inclined to support welfare or support people having this right to social welfare. Okay. Putting the two questions together, okay, 6 and 7, which are very closely related, okay, we can also see some discrepancy between people's idea of the goal of the society, okay, and what they think about who should be responsible to achieve those goals. Okay. So back in question 6, okay, 90% or 87 to 90% of the people agrees that the goal of the society should be ensuring everyone a basic level of living standard. Okay? But when we talk about the reason why a person cannot achieve this basic living standard or poor, 26% of the general public think it's because of that person's laziness. So implicitly, it means that the person himself should have the responsibility to pull himself out of poverty. Okay. However, actually this shows a dissonance or discrepancy between some people's idea of the reasons of poverty and our human rights perspective on poverty, okay, which also corresponds to the previous question 3 that Kevin has mentioned. Okay. So a human rights perspective to poverty means that the society would treat every person as equal, okay, and a person has a right by virtue of being a human, and it is not conditioned upon performance or the person's contribution to the society. Okay? And a right would means a corresponding duty of the government to protect that right. Okay? Some people think it would be unfair to the hardworking people to grant a right to welfare to the poor. So therefore, the right to an adequate standard of living would prioritize to provide a basic level of living to those who are unable to meet that basic standard. Okay? And beyond that, the government's responsibility would be to create a fair and equal society so that people can earn their own living. Okay? Okay. So finally, do Hong Kong people recognize and treasure the right to welfare can be discussed in relation to several more specific items. Okay. So we have often heard about this lion rock spirit in Hong Kong, which means Hong Kong people should rely on themselves and hardworking so as to increase their living standard. Okay. But somehow this spirit has been used by the government to discourage the implementation of universal pension in Hong Kong. Okay? It's not to say that human rights standards means universal pension must be implemented. Okay? But the basic responsibility of the government is that it would have the duty to prioritize those elderly who are not able to meet an adequate living standard. So we have to look at universal pension reform in light of the human rights obligations. Okay? And also the way in which the government spends its money, okay, and charges tax would also be affected by the way they viewed the right to welfare. Okay? People's willingness to pay more tax to ensure everyone a basic level of living standard would also be affected by whether they agree with this right of social welfare. Okay, so in conclusion, I would say there is no consensus in Hong Kong as to the extent by which the government should have the responsibility to help the poor, even though overwhelmingly people want everyone in the society to have an adequate standard of living. So I believe there is a need for more discussion on this issue in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. So we are a bit early, but I think we can have a break in here for 15 minutes, and then we'll come back for Ms. Karen Lee's discussion, and we'll open to the floor for Q&A. Okay, so there are refreshments ready outside.
阿 Ben 冇嚟未嚟啊？